You may notice something important once you begin watching how human beings actually change. Almost no one is transformed by information alone. People can hear a fact, agree with it, repeat it, and still remain internally untouched. Yet the moment that same truth arrives through a story, a symbol, a memory, or a living image, something deeper begins to move. This is not because humans are irrational. It is because the mind does not only organize through concepts. It organizes through pattern, relationship, tension, identity, and felt meaning. That matters more than most people realize, because many assume understanding happens when an explanation becomes logically clear. Logic does help, but logic usually arranges what the mind can already hold. Story does something different. Story gives the mind a structure large enough to carry contradiction, emotion, sequence, consequence, and self-recognition all at once. In that sense, story is not the opposite of truth. It is often the form that truth takes when it is finally able to enter a human life. This is why a person can read a sentence about grief and remain distant from it, but hear one honest story and suddenly feel their whole interior reorganize. The mechanism is simple once you begin to see it. A concept is usually received at one layer of awareness, but a story recruits several layers at the same time. It lets the person feel where they are standing inside it. That is also why symbols endure longer than explanations. An explanation often becomes dated the moment its language changes, but a symbol can survive because it is not tied to one sentence. It carries compressed meaning: a doorway, a fire, a river, a spiral, a mirror, a crown, a descent, a return. These remain alive because the mind does not process them as dead labels. It processes them as containers that continue unfolding as consciousness changes. The symbol stays the same, but the person meeting it does not. Most people have already experienced this without naming it. You may hear a phrase at one age and dismiss it, then encounter the same phrase years later and feel as if it has been rewritten. The words were not rewritten, you were. The symbol did not merely contain one fixed message waiting to be decoded correctly. It held a larger field of meaning than you could access at the time, and when your interior structure changed, the symbol opened differently. This is one reason human beings understand truth through story. Story can wait for us without collapsing. Once you see that, something else becomes visible. Human understanding is not just the accumulation of correct ideas. It is the gradual reorganization of inner patterning. A person may be surrounded by brilliant explanations and still live from fear, repetition, and unconscious loyalty to old structures. But give that same person an image that reaches beneath their defenses, and suddenly what was abstract becomes intimate. They do not merely think differently. They begin to perceive themselves differently, and that shift is often where real change begins. This is why direct teaching by itself often reaches a ceiling. It can clarify, it can guide, it can even liberate confusion. But there are regions of the self that do not move because they have been instructed. They move because something has been recognized. Story creates the conditions for recognition by allowing truth to be encountered rather than merely stated. It lets the listener discover themselves in the teaching instead of standing outside it as a spectator. That discovery matters because the human mind resists what feels imposed, but it often softens before what feels discovered. When someone feels preached at, they instinctively defend their current arrangement. When someone sees themselves inside a pattern, defense becomes harder to maintain. They are no longer rejecting an outside claim. They are witnessing an inside reality. This is one of the hidden strengths of symbolic teaching. It does not always push against resistance directly. It often moves around it by making the truth more recognizable than the defense. This also explains why people remember stories long after they forget arguments. An argument asks the mind to retain conclusions. A story lets the mind retain relationships. Relationship is easier to remember because it mirrors the way reality is actually lived. People do not move through life as lists of propositions. They move through sequence, tension, decision, meaning, and consequence. Story remains because it resembles the architecture of lived experience more than abstract explanation does. And once you understand that, you begin to see why mythology appears in nearly every civilization. Every religion, every culture, every era, and even inside supposedly secular systems. Myth is not simply primitive imagination. It is an attempt to carry complex truths through memorable form. A people may not be able to preserve an entire psychological or cosmological model in technical language, but they can preserve it in image, role, conflict, and symbol. The myth then becomes a vessel, and across generations that vessel continues delivering insight, even when parts of the culture forget how the vessel was built. That does not mean every myth is equally true, nor does it mean every symbolic system should be trusted. It means the mechanism itself is real. Humans reach for myth because myth can hold more than instruction can. It can hold what is unresolved. It can hold what appears contradictory. It can hold what must be revisited many times before it becomes clear. And because it can hold these things, it often carries deeper truths farther than purely linear teaching can manage on its own. You can observe the same pattern in ordinary life, far away from formal spirituality or philosophy. A person does not say, "My identity structure is undergoing recursive instability." They say, "I feel like the ground beneath me is disappearing." That sentence is symbolic, but it is also precise. It communicates not just information, but lived reality. Another person may say, "Something in me is waking up," or "I feel split," or "I keep ending up in the same room with different faces." These are not academic statements, yet they often reveal more about actual experience than technical language does. This is where many people become confused, because they think symbolic language is less exact than analytical language. Sometimes it is less exact, but often it is exact in a different direction. Analytical language is excellent at distinction. Symbolic language is excellent at wholeness. One tells you what a thing is made of. The other tells you what it feels like, how it moves, what it touches, and where it lives inside a person. To understand human beings well, both forms matter. But when the goal is transformation, symbolic language often reaches places analysis can only describe from a distance. That is also why a teaching can remain intellectually coherent yet fail to become real. If it only satisfies the need for explanation, it may never enter the deeper patterning that governs action, memory, reaction, and identity. The person may admire the teaching, but admiration is not embodiment. Story, symbol, and archetypal language help bridge that distance because they are not merely delivering content. They are shaping the form in which content is received. They change not only what is understood, but how understanding is held. And once understanding is held differently, life begins to reorganize in subtle ways. A person starts noticing patterns they previously ignored. They hear themselves speaking from an old role instead of an authentic one. They recognize when they are repeating a family story, a cultural script, or a wound-based identity. They begin to see that truth is not always rejected because it is false. Often it is rejected because there is no inner structure available to receive it. Story helps build that structure. This is why symbolic teaching must be handled with care. Its power is real, which means its misuse is real as well. A symbol can illuminate, but it can also manipulate. A story can awaken recognition, but it can also trap a person inside someone else's interpretation of reality. So the question is never just whether story works. The question is what kind of relationship a teaching invites between symbol and listener. Does it open perception or demand obedience? Does it deepen awareness or replace awareness with fascination? That distinction becomes essential once you begin looking at any living framework that uses imagery, mythic language, archetypes, or realms of meaning. The mature use of symbol does not ask the listener to abandon discernment. It asks them to bring more of themselves into the act of understanding. It offers images not as chains, but as instruments. It trusts that truth can survive examination, and that a symbol becomes stronger, not weaker, when its function is understood. That is why the deepest symbolic systems are not trying to hide behind story. They are using story because story is one of the few forms spacious enough to carry layered truth without flattening it. So when you ask why humans understand truth through story, the answer is not simply that story is easier or more entertaining. The deeper answer is that story mirrors the architecture through which human consciousness actually organizes experience. It carries sequence, consequence, identity, tension, transformation, and memory in one living form. It lets truth arrive as something inhabited rather than merely defined. And once that becomes visible, a larger question begins to emerge beneath the surface of the teaching. If story is not a decorative way of speaking, but one of the deepest structures through which humans receive reality, then what exactly are we doing when we choose the symbols that teach us how to see? The symbols that teach us how to see do more than decorate perception. They quietly determine what kinds of meaning we are able to notice, what kinds of complexity we are able to tolerate, and what kinds of truths we are likely to reject before they ever reach us. A person trained only to trust what can be flattened into literal statement will often miss the deeper structure moving beneath their own life. They may still be intelligent, observant, and sincere, but their range of recognition becomes narrower than reality itself. That narrowing does not happen because truth has become absent. It happens because only one doorway has been left open. This is why the shape of a teaching matters as much as its content. Two people may be offered the same insight, but the form in which it arrives can determine whether it lands as information, resistance, or revelation. If the teaching arrives in a shape the listener has no inner room for, it remains external. But if it arrives in a form that mirrors how the listener already organizes experience, it begins to cross the threshold. The truth has not changed. The pathway of entry has. You can observe this in simple human conversation. Someone tries to explain a recurring pattern in your life, and perhaps you hear them politely but do not change. Then months later, a scene in a film, a line in a novel, or a memory from your own past makes the same pattern undeniable. The mechanism here is not mysterious. Narrative and symbol create self-locating recognition. They do not merely tell you what is true. They place you inside the pattern strongly enough that denial becomes difficult to maintain. That self-location is one of the most important functions of story, and it is usually underestimated. Many people assume stories are valuable because they make teaching easier to digest. But the deeper reason is that they let human beings find themselves without being cornered too quickly. Direct statement often creates a binary reaction. Agree or disagree, accept or reject, defend or surrender. Story creates a wider field. It lets a person wander into truth and recognize their own reflection there before they have mobilized all the machinery of resistance. That is why symbolic frameworks often feel more alive than purely analytical ones. Analysis can explain structure, but symbols often let structure become inhabitable. A map can tell you where the river flows, but standing by the river tells you something different. You hear movement, depth, direction, and force all at once. In a similar way, symbolic language allows the mind to stand beside what analytical language may only outline. This does not make symbol superior in every case, but it does reveal that symbol and analysis are serving different dimensions of understanding. Once you begin to see that difference, another question opens. Why do some symbols remain powerful while others feel empty almost immediately? The answer is not merely aesthetic. A symbol remains alive when it stays connected to actual patterns of experience. It becomes empty when it is repeated after its living relationship to experience has been severed. In other words, a symbol is not powerful because it sounds elevated. It is powerful because it continues to reveal something real each time consciousness encounters it from a new depth. This is where many frameworks weaken themselves without realizing it. They mistake dramatic imagery for meaningful imagery. They think complexity of language is the same as depth of perception. But people eventually feel the difference. A symbol rooted in reality keeps unfolding because it corresponds to something the listener can confirm in life, memory, behavior, perception, or interior change. A symbol that exists only to impress may create fascination for a moment, but it cannot mature into insight because there is nothing substantial inside it to keep meeting the listener as they grow. That distinction matters because human beings are not only shaped by the stories they believe, they are also shaped by the stories they rehearse without noticing. A person may say they do not care about myth or archetype, yet live inside a private mythology of failure, abandonment, superiority, chosenness, exile, rescue, punishment, or endless becoming. These are not always spoken out loud, but they quietly organize expectation. They influence what people notice, what they fear, what they assume is possible, and what kind of future they imagine themselves moving toward. So even the person who claims to reject symbolic thinking is often living from unexamined symbolism. You can see the same mechanism in identity itself. Identity is rarely just a list of factual traits. It is a narrative arrangement. People tell themselves who they are through remembered scenes, interpreted wounds, repeated roles, inherited meanings, and anticipated destinies. They may describe themselves as practical, spiritual, strong, broken, misunderstood, chosen, late, hidden, called, forgotten, or destined. Each of these carries symbolic weight. Each of them does more than describe. Each of them organizes attention. That means story is not only something humans consume, it is something humans continuously generate. We narrate our pain. We narrate our motives. We narrate our relationships. We narrate our past until it becomes the lens through which we interpret our future. And because this is happening constantly, the question is not whether we live through story. The question is whether the stories shaping us are conscious enough to be examined, refined, and, when necessary, outgrown. This is one reason mature teaching does not simply hand people new symbols and call that transformation. It helps them become aware of the symbolic structures they are already living inside. It reveals the hidden architecture of meaning that has been guiding perception all along. Once that becomes visible, the listener gains a different kind of freedom. They are no longer only reacting to content. They are beginning to see the machinery by which content becomes reality inside them. That is a deeper threshold than agreement. And once a person can see that machinery, they begin to understand why some truths felt inaccessible for so long. It was not always because the truth was hidden, or because they lacked intelligence. Sometimes the inner narrative through which they were organizing life had no place for that truth to land. A person organized around unworthiness may not be able to receive love without distortion. A person organized around control may not be able to receive uncertainty without panic. A person organized around inherited fear may interpret freedom as danger. The teaching did not fail. The receiving structure was not yet available. This is why transformation is often less about learning a new idea than about becoming a different kind of listener. The same words can mean different things depending on the structure meeting them. The same symbol can feel naive at one stage of life and devastatingly accurate at another. The same story can entertain one person and awaken another. So real teaching is not only transmitting information forward, it is helping construct the kind of interior capacity through which deeper recognition becomes possible. That is also why careful symbolic teaching carries responsibility. If symbols shape perception, then the people who work with symbols are never handling something neutral. They are participating in the formation of inner worlds. Done well, this opens spaciousness, self-recognition, discernment, and depth. Done poorly, it can produce dependency, confusion, inflation, and false certainty. The difference often comes down to whether the framework keeps returning the listener to their own capacity for recognition, or whether it slowly teaches them to surrender that capacity to the framework itself. A healthy symbolic system does not become stronger by making the listener smaller. It becomes stronger by increasing the listener's ability to see. It does not ask for obedience to image. It asks for an honest relationship with what the image reveals. It does not pretend the symbol is the truth itself. It uses the symbol as a vessel that can carry the listener toward contact with truth. This keeps the teaching alive, because it allows the symbol to remain a bridge rather than hardening into an idol. That is where a deeper perspective begins to emerge. Human beings understand truth through story, not only because story is memorable, emotional, or culturally ancient. They understand truth through story because consciousness itself seems to organize meaning relationally. We do not live in isolated propositions. We live in fields of consequence, memory, identity, conflict, and unfolding. Story mirrors this. Symbol mirrors this. Myth, at its most skillful, mirrors this. It gives the mind a pattern that resembles how life is actually encountered from within. And when a teaching begins to mirror that inner encounter faithfully, something subtle but powerful happens. The listener does not merely gather more ideas. They start recognizing the forms through which meaning has always been moving. They notice why certain images have followed them through life. They understand why one phrase can activate years of memory, while 100 explanations leave no trace. They begin to sense that truth is not always absent when they feel confused. Sometimes it is present, but waiting for the right form. That realization changes the role of the teacher as well. The teacher is not merely the one who possesses the explanation. The teacher is also someone who understands form, timing, sequence, and symbolic precision. They know that truth must often be arranged in a way the listener can actually receive. They know that saying more is not the same as revealing more. And they know that one living image, offered at the right moment, may reorganize a person's perception more deeply than an hour of correct analysis. So the question grows more precise now. It is not simply why humans understand truth through story. It is also how story becomes responsible, how symbol stays alive without becoming manipulative, and how a framework can use mythic language without asking the listener to confuse imagery with unquestionable reality. Because once you begin to see that story as one of the deepest structures of human understanding, you can no longer afford to treat symbols carelessly. You have to ask what makes a symbolic system clarifying rather than confining, and that question leads directly into the next layer of what story is actually doing. When it begins to shape the way a person sees the world, a symbolic system becomes clarifying rather than confining when it keeps helping the listener see more reality instead of replacing reality with itself. That is the dividing line. A clarifying symbol opens perception outward. A confining symbol redirects perception back into loyalty to the symbol, the framework, or the authority speaking through it. Both may feel powerful at first, but only one leaves the listener more awake than before. The other may leave them impressed, dependent, or emotionally activated, yet less able to trust their own honest recognition. You can feel this difference in your own life if you pay close attention to what happens after a teaching moves through you. Some teachings leave you with greater precision, more grounded observation, and a clearer relationship to your own experience. Other teachings leave you with borrowed language, emotional intensity, and a strange inability to describe what has actually changed. The first type tends to strengthen discernment. The second type tends to substitute atmosphere for understanding. This is why the effect of a symbolic system matters more than the drama of its presentation. A healthy framework does not fear examination because examination is one of the ways living truth proves itself. If a symbol is connected to something real, then the more honestly it is looked at, the more it tends to reveal. It may require patience. It may unfold in layers. It may mean more tomorrow than it meant today. But it does not collapse simply because someone asks what it is doing, why it works, or how it relates to direct experience. In fact, one mark of a mature symbolic teaching is that explanation deepens the symbol rather than dissolving it. This matters because many people were taught, somewhere along the way, that mystery and clarity are enemies. They were given the impression that if something can be explained, it loses its sacredness, and if something feels powerful, it should remain beyond questioning. But that is a dangerous confusion. True depth does not depend on vagueness. A living symbol can remain spacious while also becoming more intelligible. The point is not to strip away wonder. The point is to prevent wonder from being used as a shield against honesty. You may notice something interesting here. The strongest symbolic systems often become stronger when you understand their mechanism, because the mechanism reveals how carefully they were built. Once you see how image, sequence, archetype, tension, and narrative placement shape reception, you do not necessarily become disenchanted. You become more alert. You begin to appreciate that symbolic language is not simply ornamental. It is functional. It can carry contradiction without collapsing it too early. It can hold layered meaning without flattening it into a slogan. It can guide a listener into recognition without forcing them into premature agreement. That is why not every use of mythic language is mythologizing in the weak sense people often fear. There is a difference between using imagery to inflate a framework and using imagery to make depth receivable. There's a difference between creating an untouchable world of symbols and creating a symbolic architecture that helps people organize perception. The first tends to ask for fascination. The second tends to ask for participation. One wants to be believed. The other wants to be understood. This is where responsibility becomes practical rather than abstract. If you are building or speaking through a symbolic framework, the question is not only whether the language feels resonant. The question is whether the resonance leads to clearer seeing. Does the image illuminate actual human patterns, or does it simply add grandeur to confusion? Does the narrative help a person notice how identity, memory, fear, projection, and meaning are working in them? Or does it distract them from that work by giving them more captivating scenery? A symbol is serving life when it returns the listener to contact with something real. You can observe this through experience, not theory. Imagine a listener hearing a symbolic teaching about descent, fragmentation, return, remembrance, awakening, or internal architecture. If that teaching is clarifying, the listener begins to recognize their own inner dynamics with more honesty. They notice where they split from themselves. They see how an old role still governs their reactions. They understand why a certain longing has followed them for years. The symbol becomes useful because it sharpens contact with experience. But if the teaching is confining, the listener often becomes more occupied with maintaining the symbolic world than with examining their own life. This is also why literalism can miss the point of symbolic truth without actually protecting a person from error. Some people think the safe position is to dismiss all symbolic language unless it can be reduced to direct factual claim. But life itself does not present meaning that way. A person can know every fact about grief and still not understand the shape of grief. A person can memorize the language of identity and still not recognize the story governing their own choices. Literal explanation has enormous value, but it does not exhaust reality. Human beings still require forms that can carry interior complexity. At the same time, symbolism without grounding becomes unstable. It begins drifting away from the listener's actual life, and instead asks them to inhabit a separate atmosphere of meaning. This often feels profound at first, because distance from ordinary life can resemble transcendence. But eventually, the cost appears. The person may become less precise, less honest, less anchored, or more susceptible to suggestion. So the mature path is neither flat literalism nor unrestrained symbolism. It is a disciplined use of symbol that keeps returning to reality, consequence, and lived recognition. That discipline is easier to understand once you ask a simple question each time a symbol appears. What does this make visible that was harder to see before? That question shifts the entire relationship. Instead of asking only whether the image is beautiful, resonant, or emotionally powerful, you ask whether it clarifies pattern. Does it reveal mechanism? Does it widen perspective? Does it help experience become more intelligible? Does it change what becomes possible once understood? In that sense, you are not merely admiring the symbol. You are testing its fidelity to life. This returns us to the deeper reason humans understand truth through story. Story is not merely a pleasant wrapper placed around content. Story is one of the most ancient and precise technologies for arranging recognition. It sequences tension in a way the nervous system can follow. It links meaning to consequence. It allows identity to be encountered in motion rather than description. And because of this, story can carry a person across thresholds that pure explanation may identify but not help them cross. The story is not doing all the work, but it is shaping the conditions under which the work becomes possible. You may have already seen this in your own development. There are teachings you understood intellectually long before you embodied them. There are patterns you could explain in others before you could recognize them in yourself. Then one day, a story, a symbol, a memory, or a single image reordered everything. What had been abstract suddenly became undeniable. This was not because the image replaced truth. It was because the image finally gave truth the right form to enter your awareness fully. That is why wise teaching often moves with both care and courage. It does not fear symbolism because it knows human beings require more than flattened explanation. But it also does not hand symbols out casually, because it knows symbols can shape perception at great depth. So it uses image precisely. It layers meaning without hiding behind obscurity. It lets the listener feel the pattern while still inviting them to think clearly. It trusts that if the symbol is alive, deeper understanding will not diminish it. It will reveal why it was necessary. And once this becomes visible, another implication appears. The question is no longer only why humans understand truth through story. The question becomes what kinds of stories create more honest people, more awake people, more discerning people, and what kinds of stories merely produce intensity without insight. Because stories are always training perception. They are always teaching the listener what to notice, what to fear, what to hope for, what to identify with, and what to dismiss. In that sense, every symbolic system is also an ethical system, whether it names itself that way or not. This does not mean the listener should become suspicious of every image or allergic to wonder. It means the listener should grow skilled enough to meet symbols consciously, to ask what they illuminate, to ask what they conceal, to feel whether the teaching is enlarging reality or shrinking it to fit a single frame, to notice whether the framework is helping them inhabit truth more fully or merely giving them a more impressive way to avoid it. This is not cynicism. It is maturity. So the strongest symbolic teaching does something very rare. It honors the power of image without surrendering clarity. It respects the mystery of depth without using mystery as cover. It allows language to remain alive, archetypal, and spacious, while staying accountable to pattern, consequence, and lived reality. That is how mythic language becomes a vessel rather than a trap. That is how story becomes a bridge rather than a performance. And once you begin to feel the difference between a symbol that opens the world and a symbol that closes around it, you are already standing at the edge of the next question. If story can either expand perception or quietly govern it, then how do we begin to recognize the deeper structures that stories are building inside us long before we have words for what they are doing? If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.